The Pre-Med Year, session number 242. Hello and welcome to the three-time Academy Award-nominated podcast, The Pre-Med Years, where we believe that collaboration, not competition, is key to your success. I'm your host, Dr. Ryan Gray, and in this podcast, we share with you stories, encouragement, and information that you need to know to help guide you on your path to becoming a physician. Welcome to the Pre-Med Years. If this is your first time here, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe in your favorite podcast app. If you don't have a favorite one yet, go to medicalschoolhq.net/how-to-subscribe so you can learn how to get this podcast on your device every week for free. Now, on this podcast, I've covered a lot of different topics related to the application process, whether that's writing your personal statement, the application in general, interview prep, but I've never talked about specifically secondaries. So that's what I want to cover today. And I want to cover the most common mistakes that students make when it comes to secondary essays. Now, one of the biggest mistakes, we'll start off right off the bat. One of the biggest mistakes that students make is waiting for them to come before they start working on it. So if you're sitting there right now and you're in the middle of application season, you've submitted your primary application, if you're not writing your secondary essays, you've lost. Well, maybe you haven't lost, but you're behind the eight ball. You need to pre-write your secondary essays so that when the school sends them to you, you are prepared to send them right back, or as soon as right back as you can. Some schools will monitor how long it takes to send a secondary back, how long it takes you to send the secondary back to them. And they'll use that as a gauge to say, oh, I guess little Johnny's not that interested in coming to our school. It took him 3 weeks to respond, and our average response time is a week and a half. I guess we'll put him a little bit lower down the list. You have to remember that the medical school admissions process is a rolling admissions process. That means as soon as applications open, the clock is ticking. And that's different than almost everything else in life. When you applied to college, that's not a rolling admissions process. That's a deadline-driven process. As long as your application is in by the deadline, you are just as good as everybody else that applied. Medical school, not the same. So the earlier you turn in your primary application, the sooner you're done with your secondary essays, the secondary application, the sooner your MCAT score is in, the sooner your letters of recommendations are in, as all of that stuff is needed for your application to be complete. And as soon as it's complete, then the schools will look at you, look at your application, and determine whether or not they want to give you an interview. That's why it's so important that you pre-write your secondaries so that you can sneak in ahead of little Johnny over there who's sitting on his behind binge watching Netflix or whatever's out right now. You need to get your secondary in as soon as possible so that your application is complete before other people. So that's the most common mistake. Now, there are plenty of websites out there that will show you. You're going to ask, well, how do I pre-write the essays if I don't know what they are? The schools haven't sent them to me. The good news, most schools don't change their essays from year to year. There are a few exceptions, but most schools don't. And so you can go on to Student Doctor Network, and look at their threads. There are some other websites out there that have a list of secondary essays. If you want to volunteer and help me collect all the secondary essays for schools so I can put it on medicalschoolhq.net, shoot me an email, and I would gladly hire somebody get a small pittance of pay to help me create a nice big post so that students can come to Medical School HQ to find all of those secondaries. So you can go find the secondaries, pre-write them. You will find that writing secondaries gets easier and easier and easier over time because a lot of them are around the same theme. All right, that's problem number one. The second problem, and it's kind of wrapped into the first one, when you sit on essays for a long time. So let's say you don't pre-write them. The second biggest mistake, outside of not pre-writing them, is letting them sit on your counter, on your desk, unopened in the mailbox, wherever they're hiding. Let's say you scheduled a vacation for some random reason in the middle of application season, and your secondaries are just sitting there for a couple weeks while you're off backpacking through wherever you are. You can't do that. Again, time is important when it comes to secondary essays, the application in general, as a whole. You need to get all of that in as soon as possible. So that is the second biggest mistake outside of not pre-writing, is sitting on those essays for a long time. All right, so let's talk about the essays specifically. Now, you'll dive into these essays and you'll find out that a lot of the questions are very similar school to school. A lot of them are going to ask diversity questions. A lot of them are going to ask why this school. DOs or a lot of schools are going to ask why osteopathic medicine. So you need to be prepared to answer those. And some students will try to answer types of questions and generally answer, I'm going to answer a diversity question, then I'm going to answer what will I bring to class type of questions. Don't try to answer question batches. Just answer a school. Finish the school's essays, the secondaries for that school, and then move on to the next school. Don't try to work outside of a school framework. So you get the essays. One of the biggest mistakes that the biggest pieces of feedback that I give students as they are submitting their secondary essays to me to review is, look, Johnny, you didn't answer the question. You told this beautiful narrative story about little Susie, this patient that you helped to save, but you didn't answer the question that the school was looking for. You have to answer the question. Secondaries are so much easier to write than primary, your personal statement, because it's asking you a specific question. Now, yes, there's a lot of schools have this. Is there anything else you would like to tell the admissions committee? That's a different question for another day. But most of the questions are asking you something very, very specific. So keep that in mind. Make sure that you are answering the question. If you're getting feedback from somebody, say, hey, am I answering the question here? It's very important. You don't want to have a admissions committee reader look at your essay and go, well, I don't understand what Johnny's adding to the class, or I don't understand the diversity that he's bringing to the class. I'm not sure that he answered the question. You don't want that to happen. All right. A common question that comes in from a school on the secondary is what is it about our school that makes you want to come here? A lot of students are so generic here that I could copy and paste it from secondary to secondary to secondary, every school that asks the same question, and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So if you're writing something very generic about, well, let's just say NYU for sake of ease here. NYU is a great medical school that trains great physicians and has a track record of serving the community and helps students get early patient exposure. And that's why I want to come here. There's nothing specific about NYU in there. You need to draw up and do some research and come up with a list of programs at each of the medical schools, at class or student organizations at each of the medical schools. If you're part of the LGBT community and they have a very strong LGBT community at the medical school and you want to be part of it because they make a huge difference in the area where the medical school is, talk about that. Very specific. Mention the program by name. That's what I mean by specific. Say, oh, this XYZ program at NYU is something that is very close to my heart and something I want to get involved in. Mention very specifics, the names of things, types of research. That's the important thing. Mention mission statement, mention vision statement, do your research. A lot of those things start to look alike after a while, but do your research and see if there's anything specific that you can draw out of those things to help you write your secondaries. Another common mistake that students make is they will repeat the same stories from their primary application on their secondary, whether it's stories from the personal statement or stories from the extracurricular activities. Now, you might say, well, they're asking for my most meaningful clinical experience. Some schools will ask, like, what's been an impactful clinical experience? Well, obviously, I probably already wrote about it, right? Because hopefully that's what your primary application is centered around, is going to be one of your most meaningful clinical experiences. Don't tell the same story. You can talk about the same experience, but don't tell the same story. It's very important. Don't repeat it. Talk about the same experience. Don't tell the same story. Some essays will specifically say, don't repeat anything that's in your primary application. If that's the case, then you can't even talk about the same experience. You have to figure something else out. It's frustrating when schools do that, specifically when they ask something as impactful and meaningful as a question like, tell me about your most meaningful clinical experience, and they mention don't repeat anything from your primary application. It's like, well, what did you want me to put on my primary application? That gets frustrating too. So sometimes it's very, very frustrating. While I'm thinking about it, just a little bonus, not a very common mistake, but just a tip. Some schools will ask for a list of extracurriculars. Just copy and paste from your whatever list that you created for your primary application. Just copy and paste that in the secondary. You don't need to rework everything and reframe things and tell new stories. Just copy and paste it. Some schools, for some reason, just want it in their secondary form and not in the primary application. All right. Speaking of copying and pasting, do not get caught copying and pasting without editing. You don't want to be that student that sends a secondary essay to NYU that says, I would love to be part of Columbia's medical school next year. You do not want to get caught copying and pasting without editing. Have somebody look over your stuff, copy and paste all you want, put it aside for the day, go back and check the next day, and make sure that you are making sure that all of the names have changed, that everything is up to snuff. So that is very, very important. Don't copy and paste without editing. All right. I think that is all I have for you today about secondaries. Hopefully that was helpful. I think it was helpful, but I'm a little biased if you didn't know. I hope you got a lot of great information out of the podcast today. If you did, I would love for you to share this podcast with your friends, your neighbor, your classmates, your advisor, whoever it may be, who you think will get a lot of great value out of the episode. Outside of that, I hope you have an amazing time applying to medical schools, a successful time applying to medical schools. If you're not applying this cycle meaning the 2017 cycle for 2018, if you're listening to this at a later date, please don't make these mistakes in your application to make sure that you have the most successful application possible. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here at the Pre-Med Years Podcast and Med Ed Media.